18th century England, the prisons were overflowing. Families were moving to the newly industrialised cities, often with no support and in desperate poverty. There was rising crime rates. And in an effort to curb those rising crime rates, authorities continued to increase the penalties. There was death penalties or life imprisonment for what we would see as minor indiscretions. To break this cycle in England, they decided the best option was to send people to Australia, the ends of the earth. While they were waiting as convicts to be sent to Australia, they were often held on hulks here on the Thames, just down the river from where we are here. The hulks were decommissioned Navy ships. You can imagine how freezing and awful they were. They were hell on earth at the time. Many of those on those ships died of cholera and tuberculosis. At the same point, there was another group of people who had a vision for Australia. These saw the convicts going to Australia not just as an opportunity for a penal settlement, but a chance for the message of Jesus to go to the other ends of the earth. On the first fleet, there was Richard Johnson. Those who encouraged Johnson to go on the first fleet as a chaplain were not just wanting to send a religious representative on the first fleet. They were looking to send someone as a missionary to the ends of the earth. It's just another way in the foundation point of Australia that faith began to run deep in our nation. Stephen, in the 18th century in England, the jails were overflowing. Why were the jails overflowing?
Well, I don't think people were worse in the 18th century than they are now, but there was a lot of crime. Britain was a very divided and volatile society, and especially when times got hard, more people would turn to crime. And there were more and more laws, more severe and severer laws passed throughout the century for people trying to get to grips with what they saw as this crime epidemic.
Well, yes, crime did increase because of the Industrial Revolution, because you've got this huge mass migration to the towns, and you've got immense poverty. You lose the structures, the social structures, the authority structures of the town, and you get slums and all the rest of it.
There was a huge inflation in the death penalty throughout the 18th century. It grew exponentially. The ruling class were quite anxious about protecting their property from increasingly assertive working people. This was a time towards the end of the century of the French Revolution, and so they passed more and more laws with severe and severer penalties.
The death sentence was passed on criminals in that era for even trivial crimes. So you had thousands and thousands of people on death row, and the jails were just terrible. They were in a disgraceful condition.
The society in many ways became more humane, and people liked the death penalty less than they had done in the past. And so, judges were often refusing to impose the death penalty, even though they should have done.
The idea of transportation came as a relief to decent magistrates who were told anything over the value of £2 that is stolen, that person gets the death penalty. And you look back and you see so many people, especially young people, that the court had assessed the value of their stolen goods as £1, 19 shillings and 11 pence. So they did not have to give the death penalty. And they suddenly were given another penalty, transportation to the ends of the earth.
Wow.
And that meant that decent magistrates were given an option.
Yeah.
When transportation to America had been an option, they would put people on ships and sail them across the ocean. Now that was no longer an option. They kept putting people on ships. It was just there was nowhere for them to go. So in rivers like the Thames in London, there would be what were called hulks, which were ships which are now devoted to being prisons for people. The discovery of Australia was the perfect opportunity to deal with the overcrowded prison population, to deal with the people they didn't want to sentence to death. And it was certainly far enough away that it was out of sight, out of mind.
The first fleet arrives, it disgorges 1,000 convicts and their 700 jailers onto these shores. And there they had nothing in which to live, they had no way of gathering food from the land, they knew nothing. And these people are being herded together by their jailers, clearing the land, cutting down the trees, all of that, no taking any notice of the other people who lived there, of the Aboriginal people who looked on initially and wonder at what was happening here.
So, Bindi, what were your early years like?
Well, they were pretty tough. I had a childhood that was marred by a mother who, although she was quite loving and creative and good in many ways, she was also a heroin addict, a prostitute and a stripper.
Wow.
And I was an only child and she was a single mother. And so as I grew up, you can imagine I was exposed to many things that a little girl shouldn't have been exposed to. And those things included serious neglect, abuse, physical and sexual, and other things too. And so it was a tough childhood, to be honest, quite lonely and tough. And I was moved around from family member to family member too when her addictions became too overwhelming for her.
Was Christian faith or belief any part of your life at all?
There are times when I just mocked Christians. So I remember being a young girl in early high school and seeing a group of Christians evangelizing in Footscray, and I thought it would be hilarious if I would write 666 on my forehead and run past them hissing, which I did. And so there was that kind of disdain, I suppose. I think I just thought Christians were weak, victims, unintelligent, needing a crutch, belonging to a cult, all those sorts of things.
Your mum died early for you?
When I was 16, she was diagnosed with cancer, and it was 3 months from diagnosis to death. It was very fast. And for me, that was probably the toughest time of my entire life, because I had watched her in those 3 years come off heroin and make something of herself. But it was probably the most stable I had been with her. And then to watch her die quite quickly and tragically broke something in me.
What did you do with yourself? 16, no mum.
Well, I was already addicted to drugs when she died. I was using heavily, and throughout that last 3 months, I began to use even more heavily and have more wild and erratic behaviour. And so I quickly found myself in a relationship with a man who dealt drugs and was physically and verbally abusive. But when I was about 21, I realised that I needed to get out of this. I needed something different. I needed to change something, but I didn't quite know how. And so I broke up with that guy, and I bought a ticket to the UK, and I got a working holiday visa, and I hopped on a plane with $20 in my pocket, thinking that I would arrive and life would be better and I would leave all my problems behind. Of course, that was a lie. I arrived and all my problems came with me. And the day that I arrived, I found someone to use drugs with the very day I arrived.
Goodness.
Within a few months, I was living in a house with a drug dealer. I wasn't in a relationship with him, but I was living with him, and I began selling drugs for him in nightclubs in London.
Wow. When I was leaving college, it was my last year of college, we had this retreat. They asked us to do something I really dislike. It was this visualization process, and I'm like, oh, groan, do we have to? Anyway, but I did it as doing the right thing. What started off, I wasn't keen. I wasn't really keen to do this, But what started off as this sort of just doing the process became this quite personal vision of me looking at a book of something I'd written, and here I am late in my life, looking at this book. And the interaction around the book was that I'd written this concept of impacting Australia for Jesus. Why was Richard Johnson, the first chaplain, arrives with the fleet in 1788? Why was he in that fleet?
He was appointed as the chaplain to the fleet, the official Church of England representative. He actually owed his appointment to some very big names. William Wilberforce, who was a very influential Tory, reformist, evangelical politician, and John Newton, who wrote Amazing Grace. You know, these were huge figures in that era, 1780s. And they looked ahead a bit. They were visionaries. They could see that, well, look, this is a penal colony, but nevertheless, it's a new land, and we want to have a Christian presence there.
Richard Johnson at first said no, ridiculous idea. And then he wondered if maybe he'd been called. And then he thought, well, if I've been called, God will provide.
Yeah.
And I don't dare go against God's calling if it really is his calling.
Well, Richard Johnson himself was a decent man, I believe, and he was not disliked personally by the convicts. In fact, those who knew him when he visited the hulks as a chaplain, which he had done, said an interesting thing about him. They said he was the only chaplain who came aboard who didn't hold a perfumed handkerchief to his nose. In other words, he tried to not offend the convicts, and there are convicts who said that he was a lovely man.
It wasn't just a job. You see, for some of the early chaplains in Australia, it was just a job. Those who had not been influenced by the evangelical revival, those who didn't have vital faith, but who enjoyed drinking with the soldiers and hunting and all the rest of it, they spent all their time with the rulers rather than with the convicts.
He was also, though, a very charitable man. So contemporaneous records by convicts record that he generously gave away his own food and provisions to keep people alive, tended to the sick who came in subsequent fleets.
And he built the first church?
He did build the first church out of his own funds.
So Jane and I were married, and we'd been married for probably about a year and a half into this situation. I don't remember the conversation, but I would have told her probably when I went back.
I still remember very clearly we were living in a little granny flat before we had kids. We just got married, and the granny lived in the house and we lived in the granny flat. And I still remember Carl having a vision to impact Australia for Jesus.
And over the years, I've talked about it as this is, what I think God has put on my heart. So she's always sort of known about it. I don't remember the conversation. I don't remember her saying, well, that's ridiculous. Even though she probably thought it.
We were just a simple young couple. We married young, and, I guess, to be honest, I thought, oh, gee, that's a pretty big vision for a simple country boy, I thought it was pretty extreme, pretty big, pretty bold.
It was a huge concept, and how was this going to happen? And because I'm practical, you'd start thinking, well, how is this going to happen? And then you don't really have an answer, but you just take steps.
within a year of being in London, I was 42 kilos. I had overdosed 3 times. 3 times my heart stopped and I had to be raced to hospital and my breathing stopped. But as soon as I would come to, I would just start using again. And I remember thinking, this is it, it's over. And then came this moment where I was in a room by myself and I was thinking about these things, how hopeless life was, how I was about to check out, when for the very first time in my life, I heard God's voice, and it was loud and it was clear and it was repetitive. And he said to me over and over and over, call out to my son, call out to my son, call out to my son. And what I didn't realize at the time was that's actually biblical, that no one comes to the Father except through Jesus. And I did. I fell on my knees and I said, help me, Jesus. And within a week of that moment, I was arrested for selling drugs and locked up in prison.
Now, you wouldn't have thought that was the answer you were expecting. So what difference did that, I mean, clearly being arrested and put in jail is not a great outcome. It wouldn't seem like it, but what was happening there?
It was exactly what I needed. I needed to be pulled out of life. And from the moment that I walked into that first prison cell, I remember walking through the door of this cell, and it wasn't even in a jail, it was in the police cells. And was like the Holy Spirit hit me in the face. It was like, whew, straight away I walked in and I knew that I wasn't alone. I knew that Jesus was in the cell. And I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that it was over. Within days of being on the rehab wing, I met through my little hatch, knock on the hatch, and it opened, and there was a woman called Betty and another woman called Anita, and they were from Prison Fellowship. And they began to talk to me through the hatch, almost on a daily basis. And they just listened to me pour my heart out to them and cry and tell them my story and all my sorrows and all my woes and all my pain. And they would just respond by telling me how loved I was. I was so loved, I was so valuable.
As we go through this series, we have stories of people going into prisons as Christians in the 18th century in England. And then we have a story of like Bindi Kolchaka, where a prison chaplain comes to see her in her cell in London. And then here you are in Melbourne seeking to help people in the prison system. How do you see that in this kind of long history of this ministry?
It's something that's very close to God's heart, you know. Jesus talked about visiting people in prison. And, you know, he says in Matthew 25, you know, when I was hungry, when I was thirsty, when I was homeless, when I was a stranger, when I was in prison, you visited me. I feel like we're working amongst God's favourites. Really do feel like it's God's favourites. He goes the extra mile. He does some amazing stuff to change lives, and I find that really exciting.
When you go to see them and you're in your role as a support worker, what are you trying to achieve?
I think that it can be the darkest time of someone's life, and having someone who cares and listens can go a long way. It's amazing how you often, you might meet a woman in the community who hasn't been in jail for 10 years, and they'll come and they'll say, oh, remember when you did this, I remember when you did this. And I guess prisons can be a very dark place in a lot of ways. And so sometimes it doesn't take much to, a little bit of kindness can go a long way. And we just want the women to feel worth and value and hope.
And so there's a guy who's got a whole bunch of executives in the room, and he's got this big jar, and he puts rocks in the jar, And he says to the people in there, is the jar full? And they're like, oh, it looks pretty full to us. He says, hang on. He gets gravel and he puts the gravel through the rocks. And is it full now? And they go, they're smart. And they go, oh, I don't think so. And he gets sand and puts through the gravel and the sand. And is it full? No. And then he gets water and pours water over the top. And it's water flowing out of this jar. And he says, is it full now? And they're like, looks probably. And he says, what's the lesson? And all the executive types, which is what I would have said if I was sitting in the room, the lesson is you can always fit more in. And he said, no, that's not the lesson. The lesson is this. If you don't get the rocks in first, they won't get in. Well, so for me, rocks are my time with God. Rocks are keeping it a little bit fit, be healthy. The rocks are time with your wife and family. Those are the rocks. And, you know, if you succeed in everything else in life, but everything else is falling apart, what's the point of that? One of the reasons I ride a road bike, a mate of mine rides through the bush, you know, mountain bikes, and he says, oh, Carl, you know, the trouble with riding on the road, it's so boring, you know, and I say to him, that's exactly why I ride on the road. It's centering, and doing something healthy. And you can actually get into a rhythm and you just think through life. There's a moment of solace and quietness and stillness, which is very therapeutic. So coming back and spending time in prayer and like reading God's word and reflecting on it and praying, that sort of stuff, that becomes part of my morning routine. And then making sure that things like there are time for family, there are time for the other things that are important in life. Now, there's a board out there which I had a look at, which has Richard Johnson, Samuel Marsden, William Cowper, and all the way down, and there you are on the list as well.
It says imposter at the bottom. It says 2009 imposter.
So the first two, Richard Johnson and Samuel Marsden, were both chaplains to the New South Wales colony.
Right.
William Cowper, tell me about William Cowper, because he was the first minister here, wasn't he?
So he's the first, what you might call, parish priest or pastor. He wasn't there to do the bidding of the governor. Cowper comes out in 1809 to be the first pastor of a church, and he's here for 50 years.
Wow.
50 years.
And one of the best gifts that Cowper brought to New South Wales was he lived a very long time. And the second best gift he gave to New South Wales, he had a son who lived just as long. William Cowper, the father, was settled at St Philip's for all his life. And that meant he could begin to exercise a parish ministry, Australia's first parish clergyman, but from that base also develop the kind of ministry structures that would serve the wider colony well. Education, a whole range of what they called societies, you know, like the Bible Society, and building the institutions that would ensure that evangelical Christianity was embedded deeply in everything. And Cowper was largely responsible for a lot of those things. He was on every committee you could practically find. Yeah.
If you look at somebody like myself, who at times in my life was exposed to faith, but it didn't really take, but now lives my life serving God entirely for faith and for the faith of others and for my own faith. I think that God, no matter what, no matter how secular this country becomes, no matter what philosophies and ideologies we take on board and run with, faith is always going to be at the heart of this country. It's founded on it. We live under the blessing and favor of faith, of many, many generations of prayer. I believe my grandmother prayed for me. I believe I'm the fruit of prison ministry and prayers of generations gone before me in this country. And in that way, no matter where we go or where we head, faith will always run deep, and there will always be people who are generationally Christian and people like me who have these radical conversions to Christianity that entirely transform their lives, and I believe is going to actually then bear fruit to transform the communities around me.
Cindy, thank you.